Hey guys, here's another game against a player rated just over 1000. So what I'm doing with these games is I'm playing lower rated players around 800, 900, 1000, 1100, that kind of thing. And what we're doing is we're looking for the typical mistakes that they make so that you can identify those in your game and move on and improve. Alright, so this is actually a 60-minute game, potentially on the clock. So I decide I'm mixing things up now. I'm going to play d4, I'm going to play the London, d4, d5, and now bishop to f4, and c6 is played. And I actually make a small error in this game as well early on. So e3 is fine, and then e6. So he's kind of mirroring my London system structure here, right? Which is fine. And now I bring my bishop out, and now queen to b6. And you need to look out for this move because basically I hadn't played c3 yet, so I can't put my queen on b3, which I would normally want to do. But because he's played this c6 move, it means his queen can get out, but because of the move order that I've used, my queen can't come out there. So I'm pretty much forced really to play b3, which I didn't really want to do. Because of this structure here in this space, I'm expecting black to want to castle kingside, so I would normally like him castle the opposite side of the board just to make things interesting. So anyway, so I've pushed b3, preventing losing a pawn, and now the queen comes in with not a very convincing check. That's a typical telltale sign of beginners and improvers. They're throwing in these checks that really don't mean anything because I mean, I could block it with my knight, I could have blocked it with my queen. I chose to block it with my queen so that if he exchanges, I develop my knight for free and his queen's off the board. And he's got no development other than pawns, you see. Right, so knight to f3 comes out, and now bishop comes in, but it's not an issue because I can literally just push c3. Okay. Bishop has to retreat, and so again that was a non-threat really. He's just moved his bishop, allowed me to push my pawn, adding another defender to d4 for no major reason. And now we get some tension in the middle of the board with c5 being pushed. So I'm able now to improve my bishop. So I put my bishop here onto e5 where it's looking at this vulnerable pawn on g7 and then the rook. So if I'm able to take the pawn, the rook can't escape, I would win the rook as well. So he has to do something and he blocks with the bishop. And I now figure this is one of the most fundamental and important disciplines or ways of thinking to get your head around. Is to think, okay, well, if I take, what happens and how good is that for me? If I allow him to take, what happens and how good is that for me? Right? So chess is all about making better moves, and the way that you make better moves is you figure out, okay, if this then that, what's going to happen? Is it better, right, or is it not? And that's all there is really to it. So let's just figure this out. So before moving my queen, if I capture his bishop, let's say his knight comes out to a very comfortable natural place, then he's ready to castle and life is good, right? So there's no value in me removing one of my good attacking pieces off the board and allowing him to develop and allowing him to castle, right? On the other hand, if I do nothing and instead just try and improve one of my other pieces, then and he decides to take, then I get to improve my knight by bringing my knight up the board. His knight's still stuck in there. He's not ready to castle. I'm already castled. It's clear which option is the best one. So I decide to hold tight on this and leave the tension in place, and I move my queen. Why do I move my queen from d2 to c2? Well, I spied that h7 is defended only by a rook, and now I have two attackers against that. Alright, so let's say I can capture there, rook can't recapture because then queen takes it. And if he tries to trap my bishop with the classic, g7, g6 push, I could just swap it off for the knight, and black's not going to be able to castle that side of the board, and he's lost a pawn. So, that's good, and it's worth a prod. So black now captures on d4. I recapture with my e-pawn. The reason I recapture with my e-pawn is because I'm quite happy to start opening up this e-file, because his king is still on the e-file and it hasn't yet castled, right? So I've got ideas maybe moving that rook across. I mean, capturing with the c-pawn would also have been perfectly good, because it means that my queen's then looking at this bishop on c8, and black would have had to respond to that. But then you think, okay, well, A, is my opponent going to spot that? Probably. And B, does my opponent have an easy and acceptable response? Well, yes. He could probably just move his bishop to d7, covering that square from the queen, helping to protect his king, and he'd be alright. So I figure that capturing with e-pawn is good. Out comes the knight, getting ready to castle, but he forgot, I think, that the knight was one of the defenders of this bishop. Now, having moved the knight there, the only defender of the bishop is the g-pawn. So I'd simply go ahead and capture the bishop. Why? Because it improves, well, it makes my opponent's situation worse. Yes, I lose my nice attacking bishop, but now he's got these doubled pawns on the f-file. He's got a semi-open g-file. Of course, I need to be a little bit conscious that this rook could come over and start looking down this file. So, but that's not, it's a potential future threat. It's not actually necessarily a weakness, because it's something that I can manage. Okay, so I decide to bring my knight out. I could have captured the pawn on this move, which would I guess the rook then would have had to have come to f8. That would have been okay for me. But I'm thinking, let's play principle, connect the rooks. I might want to think at some point about bringing this knight up the board, and then this knight can kind of follow in its footsteps, maybe. So the rook does indeed come across, and I jump in and grab the pawn, making the rook move again. Well, it should move again. For some reason, black ignored the threat there. So something that's totally fundamental is what just happened and what has changed on the board. What is now on pre, meaning it can be captured, what's undefended, and so on and so forth. So I don't need an invitation. I just grab the rook, black recaptures, and now I'm an exchange and a pawn up. So the exchange means I've won a rook in return for a minor piece, which is a bishop or a knight. So now I have 2 rooks and 2 knights. My opponent has 1 rook and 3 minor pieces, and I also have an extra pawn. And black has doubled pawns on their files, so I'm feeling fairly comfortable now. So what I need to do now is consolidate my position. But another key consideration in this, despite the difference in material, is that my king is castled, relatively safe. It's got its defensive knight. Black's king, on the other hand, is still in the middle of the board. So when your opponent's king, when you're castled, your opponent's king is still in the middle of the board. What you want to do is burst open the board, right? So I move my rook across to e1, and now this pawn actually legally cannot capture. This pawn is pinned. So my intention now is to start exchanging on e5. King moves out of the way, I go and grab the pawn anyway, pawn recaptures, now I can recapture with a knight. So I've just won myself another pawn there for free. Knight comes out, I'm 4 points up in material, okay, I'm exchanging 2 pawns up. So it would make absolute sense to start swapping off knights, but I figure that actually if, by moving my knight up to f3, it's still defending this, it's doing that defensive role, and also now if black captures, I've got the option of recapturing with the knight, and this knight is looking at the pawn right in front of the king, so I want to have a knight on that square, right? So if I'd have just swapped it off, then I wouldn't have a knight on that square. I'd have a knight here on d2. So anyway, he captures and I do recapture with a knight. And now my target is clearly going to be f7. So I put my queen down on h7 with the threat of queen takes f7 checkmate. And now black is forced to respond, putting his queen there. I capture the extra pawn in the middle of the board. I'm now 5 points up. And this gave me a moment. I didn't see this move. And I did have to calculate, which squares can I go to. And I saw that all of those were unavailable, apart from that one. Fortunately, h5 is actually not attacked. So I did have stopped my heart for a minute at that point. So queen goes there. Now the rook comes across, attacking this loose pawn, undefended pawn on d4. I simply bring my rook across to defend it. I don't have to do any fireworks at this point. Bishop comes in, and I think, okay, now's the time. Let's just take that bishop off the board. I've just had a scary moment. Pawn recaptures, and now you can see with that move, you should see a possible tactic here. Okay, we've got a queen and a king in alignment with each other. So it's kind of begging for a rook to swing round and pin the queen and win the queen. So I come across with a check. First of all, knight comes in to block. Now my rook comes up to e3, and this is actually a decent move. Bringing the rook up there, kicking my queen. So this is interesting actually. I figured this out, right? Now if rook takes queen, for example, then I've got rook takes queen. Okay, but the difference is that my capture comes with check, and that means that this king is going to have to move on the next turn. All right, and when this king moves on the next turn, I could, let's say the king comes here, I could grab a pawn if I wanted to, and with check, then if the king takes, then I recapture his rook. Okay, so what we've effectively done is we've removed a couple of rooks and a couple of queens. I've got an extra pawn, another further pawn out of it, and we're left with a situation where he's going to have a knight and I'm going to have a rook, and I've got like 3 extra pawns or 4 extra pawns. So I figured that would actually work out perfectly all right. In the end, the rook comes back over to block the pin, breaks the pin on the queen, which is a very good move. But it does allow me to swap off the rooks. Now I grab another pawn, and the game's not going to go on for that much longer really, because I can now grab pawns. He blocks with the knight, effectively pinning his own knight. He should now be thinking about getting this king out of the way. So I've got a couple of options. I think a better move might have been here, rook to e1, because the knight is actually absolutely pinned. It legally cannot move. So, but then we'd probably have had king back there or king there, adding another defender. So pushing the pawn is fine. And if the king doesn't move, then d6 should win the knight. The king doesn't move. So now I just have to be careful not to get into a back rank situation. If this queen could capture my rook, that would be checkmate. So I do have to be cognizant of that. So anyway, I figure that there's no real threat. The only checks are like that and that, but either way, king takes or rook takes, so we're covered. Queen comes down there for some reason. So now I've got options. I mean, I could, for example, capture the knight with a queen, because that would come with check. It would be forcing. What I absolutely cannot do is pawn captures knight with the threat of queening on the next go, because if pawn captures knight, queen takes rook, checkmate, and I've lost the game. So I decide to force the exchange of queens. I'm up, 5 pawns, and I have a rook. So it's a situation you cannot lose, only giving away a draw really. So we exchange queens, I bring my rook up to defend the pawn, king starts to come round, I move my rook away, king goes back, and it's going to be a walk-in now. Yeah, it's really a case of just moving pawns in, and there we go. I've got 2 queens and a rook against a solitary king, so it's not going to go on for much longer. And there you go, that's checkmate using these pawns here as well. So yeah, little interesting game. Just a few issues that my opponents made. There was clearly one blunder where he missed the attack and allowed my bishop to capture his rook, going down in material. Aside from that, he played some decent chess, he played some decent moves. But this is the key. When you want to improve, when you want to break through 1,000, when you want to get higher than that, you've got to make decent moves on every turn. Right? It's a case of eradicating those unforced blunders. The guy's playing a 60-minute time format, which I approve of. I think it's a really good idea. But you've got to use your 60 minutes. You've got to make sure you scan the whole board. You've got to make sure that on every single move, you know if one of your pieces is under threat, if it's undefended, if it's underdefended, all those kinds of things. And it really is, guys. It's those a few moves in each game that can change the whole course of a game. So if you want to improve, break through 1,000 and beyond, that's what you need to do. Okay, hope it's been useful. See you later.